everybody, and good afternoon. Welcome to today's program. Today we are here to talk about gender apartheid in Afghanistan. Since the Taliban returned to power in August 2021, all the progress of last 2 decades for women and girls have been erased. The Taliban are again imposing a regime of gender apartheid in Afghanistan in violation of international law, as they did back in 1990s. The term gender apartheid refers to the systematic discrimination and segregation of women and men, and may also systematically exclude women from public spaces. Sadly, this is the reality of women and girls in Afghanistan. Through the law and policy, the Taliban are depriving women of freedom of access to healthcare, access to justice, the rights to participate in government, to work, to education, to freedom of expression, to freedom of assembly, to freedom of violence, to freedom from violence, and more. The purpose of this event is to increase public awareness about gender apartheid in Afghanistan and the human rights of Afghan women and girls. It will be examined the root causes of gender apartheid in Afghanistan, including cultural and traditional factors that contributes to its persistence. Attention also will be paid on what actions can be taken to stop this oppressive system and empower women and girls to live their lives with dignity and equality. Another important point is the response of international community to this issue, and also evaluate what more can be done to support Afghan women and girls. In addition to this, on the International Women's Day, March 8, 2023, a campaign has been launched by a prominent group of Afghan and Iranian women calling for gender apartheid to be recognized as a crime under international law. Signatories of this open letter include Iranian Nobel Peace Prize Shirin Ebadi, the first female deputy speaker of the Afghan parliament, Fawzia Kufi, a commissioner from the Human Rights Commission, Behishta Yaqubi, as well as many activists still fighting for their rights in Afghanistan and Iran. Given this worsening crisis, the gender apartheid approach is increasingly endorsed and used by many Afghan women right defenders at the forefront of challenging the Taliban practice, as the international community fails to offer a robust response. This panel will serve as a platform for the voices of these Afghan women, so their direct experience are incorporated into the discussion and analysis of these issues. Today, we are here to talk about these topics with Dr. Karima Benon. She is a professor of law at the University of Michigan. Dr. Omar Sadr, a senior researcher, scholar, Center for the Governance and Market, University of Pittsburgh. Dr. Farangiz Spanta, Peace and Conflict Researchers, Bonn International Center for Conflict Studies. Mitra Mehran, human rights activist, and also Gisuniya, human rights lawyer, and also board chair of the Iranian Human Rights Documentation Center. So my first question goes to Dr. Karima. Many people claim that there is an ongoing gender apartheid in Afghanistan. Could you please explain what it means?
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And I'm just going to share a PowerPoint presentation quickly. And okay, let me try again, because it's not allowing me to advance the PowerPoint. If not, I will answer your question without the PowerPoint. So let me try one more time here.
Yeah, we have it.
There we go. Thank you. So let me thank the Afghan Institute for Strategic Studies for inviting me to take part in this very important conversation. I have to say that when I started working on my recent academic study on gender apartheid right after the evacuations in 2021, I did not imagine that this approach would have gained so much momentum in such a short time. So this is a very exciting moment for this conversation as more and more ambassadors, experts, advocates are recognizing recognizing and using the gender apartheid framework. In my time, I'm going to provide a very quick overview of that framework, but I refer you for more information to the article that I published in the Columbia Human Rights Law Review entitled The International Obligation to Counter Gender Apartheid in Afghanistan, and also a series of 3 fact sheets accompanying that article that I prepared with my research assistant, Amulia Vadapalli, and I will share those again in my Twitter feed. So what I was trying to do by using the apartheid framework was to find a way of talking about the obligation of the international community to supporting the human rights of Afghan women and men, and making sure they couldn't simply walk away from those obligations by leaving the country. And you'll see some of the questions that I address here, including, what is the added value of this approach? What is gender apartheid? And I'll go through as many of these questions as I can very quickly. But important to note that in my work, I was also building on a history of using this concept going back to the 1990s, the first time that the Taliban were in power. And you see here one UN official who very bravely recognized what was happening in Afghanistan then as gender apartheid, specifically using that word apartheid. And this is the Tunisian law professor, Abdel Fattah Amour, who was then the UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief, and really condemned the use of what he called apartheid in Afghanistan. The problem was, I think, that the full international legal case for this, using this framework, was not made at that time, and the international community did not follow the lead of Abdel Fattah Amour or of many women human rights defenders, including Afghans, including Iranians, who were using that framework back then. And what we have to do is to make sure they do so this time. So what do I mean by gender apartheid? In my article, and really sort of adapting the definition that we have of racial apartheid in international law, I say that gender apartheid is a system of governance based on laws and or policies, and the policies piece is also very important, which imposes systematic segregation of women and men, and may also systematically exclude women from public spaces and spheres. And this concept really involves systemic oppression of women as the form of governance, and defining women, as one of the Afghan women human rights defenders I interviewed said, as, quote, not as human as men. And this is, I think, very much the way in which the Taliban mode of governance replicates apartheid South Africa, although the exclusion here is on the basis of sex or gender rather than the basis of race. And so that's what I mean by gender apartheid. Now, the German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock last year very accurately described Taliban rule as the biggest violation on earth of women's rights. And in fact, the situation has gotten worse since then. And what the apartheid framework does is pressure the international community to take action commensurate with that kind of description, that is, of one of the biggest violations on earth of women's human rights. And so I tried to look in my work back at the history of what was done to counter apartheid in South Africa. And I would say that the international initiatives and international law were only one piece. Obviously, there was grassroots advocacy going on the ground in South Africa, but that's the kind of model that we need, which is the ongoing sustained campaigning by Afghan women themselves, which is happening both in the country and in the diaspora, but supported by international efforts and initiatives. And it was really interesting to look at the literature of trying to understand how apartheid ended in South Africa. And I looked at the work here of David Walsh and J.E. Spence, who concluded that there are many factors that led to the ending of apartheid in South Africa, but that the changes that occurred in the norms governing state behavior were crucial, and that other governments, beyond the South African government, other governments had to pay deference to these new norms. And this really changed the status of South Africa in the international community. It really made it a recognized pariah during apartheid rule. And I think this is precisely what we need to do with Taliban Afghanistan, although I acknowledge that the country situations and indeed the times are distinct. Now, the most important standard we have on apartheid in international law is the Apartheid Convention. And you'll see here that it defines apartheid, strictly speaking, in racial terms. But we also see that a number of experts, including a very prominent Black South African woman legal academic, have suggested that this definition would be very appropriately applied to a situation like Taliban Afghanistan if you simply substitute the word gender or sex for race here, and that the definition would be equally applicable then in this type of situation. And so what's the added value of doing this? Why do this heavy lifting of making this concept recognized? I think we get a number of things. One is that apartheid is an international crime, so that has consequences for the perpetrators of apartheid. Another, to quote the words of Shahrazad Akbar, is that the apartheid framework is, quote, a powerful mobilizing tool. And I think for me, one of the most important is that using the apartheid framework puts pressure on other governments, on international organizations, and even transnational corporations not to engage with the Taliban in ways that show tolerance for and help perpetuate grave abuses. You cannot be complicit with apartheid. And we've seen that happening already, for example, in the way in which many governments and even international organizations have sent all male delegations to Kabul to meet with the Taliban, really sort of participating in apartheid. And finally here, the other added value is it strengthens the pariah status of the perpetrators, and that is essential going forward to make sure the Taliban remain on sanctions lists, to make sure they don't get travel exemptions, and to make sure they do not hold the seat of Afghanistan in the UN while perpetuating these grave violations of international law. So I think this framework needs to be driven by Afghan women themselves, but with the international support that they merit. And much more to be said, but I will stop there because I think my time is up. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Saeb. So my second question goes to Dr. Saeb Sadr. I wanted to ask you, Dr. Saeb, that are there any cultural and also traditional factors that contribute to the persistence of gender apartheid in Afghanistan?
Thank you so much. Let me also thank Institute of Strategic Studies, Afghanistan Institute of Strategic Studies, for organizing this timely webinar. And it's an honor to share this webinar with esteemed co-panelists. To understand gender apartheid, I will use lens of cultural relativism. And by that, I think I can respond to your question, what are the cultural justifications for that? To begin with, mass deprivation and transgression of women's rights and the establishment of a gender apartheid regime are based on cultural ideological norms and assumptions. This does not suggest that certain cultures are more prone to cultural apartheid, gender apartheid than others. I certainly do not want to fall into the culturalist argument. However, what cultural relativism means is that infringement of fundamental rights, which are based on universally upheld principle, is taking place once a state or an actor neglects the universality of the regime of rights and appropriates a cultural justification for its policies. To counter the universality of human rights, culture, religion, and customs are presented as a base for entitlement of rights. In other words, it restricts women's rights relative to their ascriptive religion or culture. While the practice of mainstream Muslims now across the world defies the limitation of fundamental rights, the authoritarian regimes, in certain cases, even sultanistic regimes in the Muslim world, have upheld enforcement of a conservative form of Sharia law in an idiosyncratic manner. Of all of them, the two regimes of Islamic Emirate of Taliban in Afghanistan and Islamic Republic of Ayatollahs in Iran share a common policy of subjugation and segregation of women to the extent that it constitutes gender apartheid. A historian, Jan Cole of University of Michigan, argued once with respect to the first Taliban rule and Ayatollahs of Iran in 1980s that both regimes privatized women by drawing a line between private and public and bringing medieval motifs to the modern recreation of power as representation and exercise of power as a spectacle. The same logic still prevails in the second phase of Taliban in the 21st century. At the center stage of this project is that political Islam is privatizing women and limiting them to the household. Now, as Taliban regime is an ethno-religious group that it relies both on Afghan ethno-nationalism and Islamic fundamentalism, cultural relativists justify the gender apartheid with reference to both local Afghan or Pashtun culture and Islam. Sources of cultural relativism in this case rest both at local culture and transnational Islamic fundamentalism. But similarly, the narrators and defenders of cultural relativism in both cases are both local and international. For instance, if you remember, Pakistan's permanent representative in the United Nations in February 2023 claimed that the restrictions on rights of women in Afghanistan comes from Pashtun culture. 2 months earlier to that, Prime Minister of Pakistan, Imran Khan, in a meeting at OIC in December 22, he claimed that every society's idea of human rights and women's rights are different. If we were too sensitive to cultural norms of these people, even if we pay a stipend to the people of Afghanistan, they won't send their girls to schools. So such remarks by a neighboring country that has been accused of having a vested interest in preserving and supporting Taliban rule could be accounted as colonialism. Cultural relativism to justify deprivation of rights of a group of people by a foreign actor is a mark of colonialism. Colonialism deprives the colonized people of their right to self-determination based on a relativist assumption. In other words, or in the words of Mariam Namazi, cultural relativism is a racist phenomenon as it legitimizes deprivation of rights by segregating people who are living in the same country based on religion. And for example, not just in Afghanistan, but in some Western countries, you see ghettoization of people wherein different standards of law or Sharia law are applied on Muslim women. Now, in this context, many secular nationalists in Afghanistan denounced Pakistan's remark. However, the nationalists do repeat a reductionist narrative that projects Taliban exclusively as Pakistan's proxy. Such an approach prevents a holistic perspective that should look at domestic and ethnic sources of Taliban conservative communalism. For instance, on September 11, 2022, the Minister of Education of Taliban, Nurullah Munir, while he was visiting Uruzgan province, he said that people simply do not allow their daughters to go to school. So that's why it's not our problem, it's people's issue. And later on in December, Nida Muhammad Nadim, Taliban Minister of Higher Education, said that education for women clashed with Islam and Afghan values. So he justified this based on, again, norms and values. Now, one should not be surprised that resemblance between Taliban's phrase, quote unquote, Afghan and Islamic values and Saudi Arabia's basic law of governance phrase, Arab and Islamic values, are both regimes share the patriarchal system of segregation and subjugation of women. Now, finally, to the last point for this remark, the relativist standpoint has two pillars to my point of view with respect to women in Afghanistan. First, it puts communal values above human rights, so that the scope of rights should be determined based on culture and ways of life. Second, it defines human dignity as purely integral to community that does not recognize individuals' autonomy. So even some human rights scholars in the West has also fallen in this trap of cultural relativism. For example, an anthropologist called Alison Ritlin of University of Southern California who believes in ethical relativism argued that no truth assertion is acceptable if it is based on an abstract universal principle ignoring a specific culture. Accordingly, she believes that a cross-cultural belief for human rights increases the likelihood of its acceptability. Now, on the contrary, refuting the relativist standpoint, Reza Afshari believes that relativism empowers cultural significance of state administration of society in Muslim world, while Islamist rule in such societies, for example, Afghanistan and Iran, is driven by political interest. According to him, the unrealized Islamic expectations in Iran indicates the problem of a discourse that assumes cultural primacy for a legal foundation of human rights in the modern state. One can argue the same thing about Afghanistan. As the women and people are defying Taliban rules, one can see that how the situation is similar in Iran and Afghanistan. So Afshari rightly argues that drawing a cultural foundation for human rights in a context where a state redefines culture and subjects it to its modus operandi is not only highly unlikely, but dangerous. So for example, if Taliban claim to restrict women's rights based on culture, so what kind of culture? It's of course the culture that Taliban define it. It's not something which is out there. And finally, according to Afshari, Muslim cultural relativists who aim to amend the universal human rights scheme are in two groups. First are those who try to claim that they are Islamizing modernity. For example, the Taliban, who completely reject the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, labeling it as a Western value. And instead, they try to offer a human rights scheme which according to their own Sharia. The second category are the ones who try to present an Islamic base for the modern human rights scheme. In other words, their main interest is modernization of Islam. And some opponents of Taliban who are still in the category of conservative Muslim, they also try to claim human rights for women, but from an Islamized perspective. So even that has certain limitations that I might come to it in later stage. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Saib. Before I go to Dr. Spanta, I just wanted to mention that you can drop your questions and we will try to answer them all in the end of our discussion. Dr. Spanta, to you. I just wanted to ask, to what extent political instability and conflict in Afghanistan has worsened the issues of gender apartheid in the country?
Well, thank you for having me today in this distinguished round of experts, and I hope I can answer this very difficult question you just raised. And I'm very glad that you provide me the opportunity to share my thoughts on the topic on gender apartheid in Afghanistan. As a peace and conflict researcher, I will focus more on the second part of today's title, which is engaging with the Taliban beyond condemnation. We came here together to also look beyond condemnation and to find a controversial path of engagement with rulers who are in power now and who are fostering their power even beyond Afghanistan's borders. Or shall we speak about a radical split with the regime and engage with different forms of resistance? In my short, hopefully short outline, I will draft the dilemmas and potential different angles for engagement with the current de facto authorities. The most controversial question is isolation or engagement. Almost 2 years after the takeover of Kabul by the Taliban, the international community still struggles to find its way between isolation and political engagement with the Taliban authorities. The ban of girls from school from grade 7 to 12, the prohibition of women to study at universities, going for walks in parks or working for international NGOs or domestic NGOs, and legalizing child marriage from the age of 13 made it for the international community impossible to establish official political ties with the Taliban representatives in Kabul. The Taliban are highly aware between which dilemmas the international community is oscillating. At the same time, the international attention is giving the apartheid regime more leverage in reacting with more severe decrees and policies restricting women and girls' rights in the Afghan society. In overall, after discussing different scenarios of whether engaging or disengaging with the Taliban, I came to the conclusion, in order to mitigate the Afghan population's suffering and to hinder that 90% of the population lives on the verge of food insecurity, the international community with its democratic principles and the UN has to stay beside the Afghan population. I believe that it is crucial for the donors to go beyond the current humanitarian aid and the humanitarian plus approach. Engagement through a humanitarian development peace nexus is under the current political circumstances far-fetched, but it would be a long-term and as a consequence, the most sustainable approach for Afghanistan and its society. In this situation of droughts, dire hunger, conditions, human rights abuses against all marginalized groups of the society, gender-based violence and genocides, a truly Afghan-led approach through the already active society members and classic NGOs is of major importance and could be implemented through a coordinated approach by Afghan and international NGOs. But let me underline that under the current circumstances and the appeasement politics by the Western diplomats with the Taliban any help beyond humanitarian aid would not motivate the Taliban to continue, would motivate the Taliban to continue with their misogynist politics. Recently made statements in European countries about a new feminist foreign policy should raise the pressure on reopening the schools and universities for girls and women, abolishing the ban for women to work for international NGOs, and giving the right to move freely in public and to attend their workspaces in order to have an independent income. The other option would be to leave the Afghans with the current rulers of Afghanistan alone, isolate the country, and besides exacerbating the humanitarian crisis, also opening the legitimacy of the Taliban regime to turn towards similar authoritarian regimes in the region, who already started politically acknowledging them and bonding economic ties. Nevertheless, engagement of the democratic countries should not happen because of geopolitical interests in competition with the autocratic countries. What can the international community do in order to find its balance with the Taliban and to move beyond condemnation? First, despite of speaking about two different factions like hardliners and reformers within the Taliban, they are in their implementation of anti-woman and anti-human rights and anti-democratic structures united. Therefore, whitewashing Taliban's policies is not helpful, and their gender apartheid should be condemned as crimes against humanity. Second, the UN should tighten travel bans for the members of the Taliban. Another pressure point would also be to publicly discuss Taliban's double standards. The daughters of many Taliban representatives live, study, and work freely abroad. Why should the daughters and wives of others be domesticized like pets? The conglomerate of a draconian practice of Islamic law, the total ban of women from public appearance, and harsh persecution of the dissidents is a phenomena of modernity and could be explained as the simultaneity of non-simultaneous. This light world is a modern phenomenon and underlines the importance of progressive ideas also within a tribal and traditional society like Afghanistan. Afghanistan's youth and feminists are connected with the entire world. An intersectional feminist approach, which considers confessional rights and an inclusive future government with all members of the Afghan society, would truly open a path for equal and democratic structures. To conclude, my major argument is to keep the international community's pressure, the international solidarity and awareness of the human rights abuses which the Taliban commit on a daily basis against women and girls on their agenda. All evidences and practices hint that the policies of the Taliban in Afghanistan, especially against women, belongs to the category of crime against humanity and should be politically treated as such by the international community and henceforth also legally be persecuted as such. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Saab. Now we are going to Mitrajan Mehran. Mitrajan, I wanted to ask if women had been present during the negotiation between the Taliban and Americans, would the situation have been different? How might their involvement had impacted the outcome of the discussion?
Thank you so much. And it's an honor to be here. Thanks to the Afghanistan Institute of Strategic Studies for initiating this very timely and important discussion, and for people like Professor Karima for doing amazing research in giving us the legal platforms and frameworks to discuss what's happening in Afghanistan within the international legal framework. Situation in Afghanistan. So to answer your question, I want to mainly discuss the decrees that have been issued by the Taliban in the past 1.5 years and how that is actually gender apartheid. And that will answer the prosecution and arbitrarily arrest and torture of women in Afghanistan too. Let's assess the decrees that have issued by Taliban against Article 2 of Apartheid Convention that explain the principles in human acts that can be counted as apartheid or a crime against humanity. So in the past 1.5 years, Taliban have issued 42 around or more than 42 decrees that strip women of their basic rights and liberty. The first one within the article, it talks about life and liberty. And coming to your question, women have faced floggings, lashing on the streets. They have lost access to any means of justice, laws that protected women, including the Elimination of Violence Against Women law, are not implemented anymore. Plus, women don't have access to any means of legal injustice support. Even women who were victims of domestic violence and were living in shelters and safe houses were taken by the Taliban to the prison. And then only in the past 1.5 years, based on a recent report by Itlati Rus, 1,115 women have been imprisoned. And this number is only for 24 provinces and for those who have been in the prison for more than a month. So imagine thousands of other women who have been taken into investigation and have been kept for 1 to 3 weeks or less than a month. And then 159 women have been killed by direct fire of Taliban in the past 1.5 years. And this is just I am sure these numbers are not representing what's happening against women in Afghanistan because we don't have access to that many to the information as we should have. Article 2 talks about education, right to work, right to freedom of expression, freedom of assembly and association, and then prosecution of organizations that are working for women, and exploitation of labor. Every single inhuman act described in Article 2 of Apartheid Convention, worse than that, is happening against women in Afghanistan. And I'm writing on a paper that may come out. I have written it. It will come out in 2 weeks or 2 weeks. That against every inhuman act, there are around 4 or 5 decrees that have been issued by the Taliban. And then to be inhuman act, also it says that it should be institutionalized and it should be in a way to enforce domination of one group over another. So when we talk about 42 decrees that strip women of their basic rights, it is systematic. It's the basics of government of the Taliban, one. And then second, based on their understanding of women, they do believe in domination of men over women based on their cultural and religious interpretations. And then every single decree that is actually the legal basis of Taliban, because they don't have any constitution or anything yet, is a systematic way of discrimination against women. And then what's happening in Afghanistan, if you assess the situation, the grave discrimination and violation happening against women in Afghanistan is actually way, way worse than what happened in South Africa. For example, there was some limitation against a group of people based on their race in terms of work, right? In terms of education. But in Afghanistan, it's not about limitations. It's a totally ban. So that's why, as the speakers before and Professor Karima mentioned clearly, that we need legal frameworks, international legal frameworks, to keep Taliban accountable against what they are doing, because now no one wants to take the responsibility and there is no policy or legal framework for it to keep them accountable, and they are doing whatever they do. And I was here for the past 2 weeks in CSW, and what really bothered me is the idea of how member states are trying to not take responsibility and putting it within the theory of cultural relativism. The doctors has very well explained it. While that is not true, and what I was saying is, if women protesters and women of Afghanistan are accepting to face, the Taliban's atrocities, but they are going to streets and demand their rights, then it's very wrong that some other people outside of Afghanistan just use theory of cultural relativism and do not want to take action against it. Therefore, there is a systematic discrimination by the Taliban against women in violation of their basic rights. They are trying to, enforce domination of men over women. And what's happening there is way worse than what happened even in South Africa. And it's everyone's responsibility to act and listen to the women of Afghanistan. And one more thing that I want to mention here using this opportunity, and I conclude with that, is when we talk about all of this, give that recognition in political agency and legitimacy to women of Afghanistan and respond to their demands and work with them, and instead of using cultural relativism theory and just being neutral about the grave inhuman acts Taliban are committing against women of Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mitra Jan. Gesu Jan, to you, I just want to ask you how the international community has responded to the issues of gender apartheid in Afghanistan.
Thank you. And I'm really honored to be here with this group to talk about what is a really important issue. I should say that the lens at which I'm coming through this is having worked on human rights in Iran for more than a decade. And I think, so what we've done recently is there's a group of Iranian women lawyers and activists, and also Afghan activists and lawyers, and also international criminal and human rights lawyers, including Professor Benoune right here, who've come together to really demand that there be concrete action from the international community. And the reason that we all wish to unite Iranian and Afghan women in this cause, and all of our allies and those that are working on the legal framework, is because I think that there's a lot of policy attention to Iran at the moment. The slogan of women, life, freedom has animated a lot of governments to take certain actions that they previously wouldn't have done. And it even inspired UN member states to set up a fact-finding mission on Iran, and also ultimately resulted in the Islamic Republic of Iran being kicked off the UN Commission on the Status of Women, which was a campaign I was deeply involved in at the behest of women inside Iran, who very much wanted those of us who are outside and able to go to New York to achieve that. And I think one reason that the situation in Iran would gather a lot of attention and maybe inspire a bit more policy action is because of how it sits geopolitically. I get the sense that while the situation in Afghanistan is incredibly dire, the situation for women obviously is much more harsh than what we're even dealing with the Islamic Republic in terms of their treatment of Iranian women. Yet there seems to unfortunately be a bit of paralysis almost at this stage. I get the sense that because the US government withdrawal from Afghanistan was handled in such a poor manner, and because there's just a bit of a sense of fatigue from some of these policymakers, that they don't seem to be inspired to really tackle what is an incredibly dire situation for women and girls who are being denied education, who are systematically being stripped of all the rights that they have enjoyed now for quite some time. And I didn't get the sense that there is the appropriate urgency that's needed in addressing this. Now, obviously, the panelists here have a much better sense of where things have succeeded and failed, but I was really in the rounds that we did at the UN Commission in speaking to member states on ECOSOC who would make the vote on whether or not the Islamic Republic would be removed from the UN Commission on the Status of Women. It was shocking to me how many countries were very much in favor of these countries staying in these bodies, thinking that reform is possible, or that somehow if they just talk to them about women's rights, that they're going to change their position. And I found that to be completely fascinating. This is not the appropriate policy response that's needed. The women in these countries are asking for something very different. And I feel it's very dismissive of their voices to sort of say, well, you know, we've listened to what these mostly male government officials, in the case of Afghanistan, perhaps everybody in the Taliban is a man, but with the Islamic Republic, they put out a few token women who are very much toting a misogynist line. They say that we've listened to these representatives and, you know, we think there's a different view. This should be seen as absolutely unacceptable. In my view and in the view of many others. I'm not alone in this view, and I believe I'm not alone in this view on this panel as well. And so I feel like the gender apartheid framework is absolutely the right approach, not only for the legal weight it would bring, but really for what it signifies with the word apartheid and just how grave and critical that is. Many people ask, well, isn't gender persecution as a crimes against humanity? Doesn't that cover the sort of violations that you're looking at? And the answer is no, not really, because apartheid and what it signifies with the structures, the way that women are systematically removed from public space, signifies something quite different. I also think that on a practical level, identifying these different types of crimes publicly are going to help investigators and prosecutors think more broadly about gender-based violence and gender-focused crimes. Gender persecution is a broad term and it applies to a lot of situations. Still, we haven't really seen convictions at international courts or national courts that have laws with extraterritorial application or universal jurisdiction frameworks. So in my view, there is something missing, and this is the absolute right policy approach to take, not just for legal practitioners who are really seeking to get accountability for crimes against, again, on the basis of gender and sex, but also for what it means in terms of policy weight. And the last thing I'll say is, I mean, we have racial persecution and racial apartheid as separate crimes. So I think a lot of the cultural relativism and the fact that components of this situation exist in different countries, I believe is what gives different decision makers pause, and we really need to overcome that. And I'm glad that there is this attention on this issue, and there seems to be an appetite to really move this forward.
Thank you so much. Going back to Dr. Karima, Dr. Saba, I wanted to ask you, what are some of the major arguments against gender apartheid approach, and how do you counter with those?
First of all, I have to say how much I appreciate the remarks of my fellow panelists. Really an honor to be a part of this discussion. So what are the counter arguments we are most likely to hear when we advance the arguments that we are making today, saying that gender apartheid should be recognized and should be applied to situations like Taliban, Afghanistan, and perhaps some others as well? Well, we've talked about some of those already, and I addressed them in detail in my paper. The first is cultural relativism, which I think was so clearly and really importantly described and denounced by my fellow panelists. I also want to be clear that international law has completely rejected cultural justifications for violations of human rights, whether on the basis of race or on the basis of sex. And if you look at the apartheid jurisprudence of the International Court of Justice, for example, in the Namibia case, They were not interested at all in hearing the arguments of the then government of South Africa seeking to justify apartheid, including in terms of religion. Those were deemed completely irrelevant. And the same thing, same approach absolutely should apply to gender apartheid. And lest the academic critics of universality think they've won, universality remains the stance of international human rights law agreed by governments from every region of the world. So all of the new human rights standards that we have, the ones that have been adopted recently, not just going back to the era of the Universal Declaration, they have all reaffirmed universality of human rights. That is, that everyone, everywhere, whatever groups they are assumed to fit into, has equal humanity and equal human rights. I really want us to take up what Dr. Sadr and Mitra Jan and others said and challenge academia. I myself am a law professor. I'm a professor of human rights law, and I am shocked by those within academia living in contexts where they may assume their own human rights are being respected, but relativizing away the rights of others. And these arguments are becoming increasingly politically correct, and actually they undermine no one more than human rights defenders in the global South, who are some of the strongest defenders of human rights in the world today. So I hope that some of us can come together, and I see there's some questions about this, and find ways to really challenge the Western Academy and the Academy in other parts of the world as well on these issues. One of the other counter arguments that you get against the gender apartheid approach is that you don't have any specific text in international law to point to that affirms this concept. That also is very easily taken care of, actually, when you look at the way that international law has been interpreted in a forward-looking manner over time. So take the Akayesu case before the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. This was a case about genocide. And you will note that the Genocide Convention, very important convention, but drafted in the 1940s, says nothing about gender or sex or rape as a means of committing genocide. And yet, looking at the facts on the ground in Rwanda, that International Criminal Tribunal recognized that rape could be a way of committing genocide, primarily against women, perhaps also against others. So it's completely normal that we have a forward-looking interpretation of international law over time. And I say in my paper that we need a 21st century version of apartheid informed by the goal that has been set by states, which is to achieve gender equality by 2030. We didn't set that goal. States from around the world set that goal in the Sustainable Development Goals. So there are many interpretive strategies. I don't have time to describe them here that we can take on. The last thing I would mention is just the issue of alternatives. Very often you're told there are these other concepts, systematic discrimination, gender-based persecution, and Gisujan addressed these very well. But I would simply say that I see the gender-based persecution strategy and the gender apartheid strategy as complementary. And I very much support those like Lisa Davis at the International Criminal Court working to advance the concept of gender-based persecution. But it is not an alternative to gender apartheid. And in fact, if you look at the definitions of these concepts in the Rome Statute, you will see how different they are. Apartheid is about the ideological mode of governance, that is to say, the persecution being the form of government. This is rather different than the concept of persecution. And the other key piece that we get from apartheid is implication of all actors, all states, all international organizations who have an obligation to take effective action to counter and end apartheid. So apartheid is not a topic for constructive engagement. We learned that with South Africa. Apartheid is an illegal situation to be ended. And sorry for the long answer.
Thank you so much. Before we go to the questions from the audience, I just wanted to ask the last question from Dr. Saib Sadr. Dr. Saib, I wanted to know what is the role of Islamic scholars in Afghanistan in addressing gender equality, and also how can they contribute to promoting women's rights within the framework of Islamic teachings?
I think to understand that, we have to look at the practices of other Muslim countries, and particularly Muslim scholars or Sharia scholars, to how they have developed human rights scheme differently. So in that case, it's a total failure. And the failure comes from a multiplicity of human rights schemes in the Western world, which is both inherently paradoxical, but sometimes they're also contradictory with each other, these different schemes which exist at the national level. For example, Professor Anna Mayer of University of Pennsylvania highlights that the relevant textual authorities are conflicting and scant in this Muslim world. For instance, how can we reconcile a woman's Islamic right to have legal personality, right to property, and do business with the Islamic provision restricting women to not engage with men in society? So these two are in contradiction within the Islamic text. Mayer's research also highlights that each Muslim country has developed its own scheme of human rights at the national level, claiming to be Islamic now, while they are also not consistent with each other. What unifies all of these schemes together is only one thing: the provisions with respect to regulation of women. For example, comparing Iranian Constitution of 1979, Al-Azhar draft of Constitution in 1978, Cairo Declaration of Human Rights in Islam in 1990, and finally, Saudi Arabia's 1992 Basic Law of Governance, she finds out that only thing that all of these laws in the Muslim world, which are drafted by the Muslim scholars, could be unified as their firm opposition to the idea of gender equality, but instead they try to confine women into domestic sphere, particularly family. And now one can add a stark commonality between the mentioned laws and the Taliban rhetoric with respect to women's rights is the shared vague phrase that they use, quote unquote, within the framework of Sharia, or sometimes principles of Sharia. So Taliban's time and again they use. And such kind of phrase you can find also in all other laws that I just mentioned. So if that is the case, the only solution is to go beyond this cultural relativist understanding, and also the claim that there should be a cross-cultural base for human rights. I understand that there should be certain cross-cultural, but these cross-cultural understanding for human rights should not prevent us to agree on at least fundamental issues within human rights, for example, which should not be violatable at all. Now, let me also come to a point which I think is raised in the chat box also, how to address cultural relativism. And I think to address that, we have to do three things, and 3 points are important to my understanding. First of all, Taliban, we have to understand the nature of Taliban regime. It's an apartheid, yes, but politically also Taliban regime is a heightened authoritarian regime, which manifests some features of sultanistic regimes. What is a sultanistic regime? A sultanistic regime is a regime which, unlike totalitarian regime, operates based on mere discretion of its leader. So that means institutional autonomy didn't exist in such kind of regime. So for example, in Taliban, when Taliban leader Mullah Hibatullah says something, and that's a decree, no one within the Taliban regime and ranks and files cannot oppose it. For example, even the so-called moderate Taliban who seems to be uncomfortable with these decrees, they cannot go and totally oppose these kind of decrees which comes from Hibatullah. So if that is the case, how do we deal with a sultanistic regime? Now, in terms of two other scholars that I would love to cite from Yale University, Alfred Stephen and Jon Lenz, they say transition from a sultanistic regime towards democracy is not an easy job. In some cases, it's impossible because the authority of the sultan, who have a full discretion, could neutralize all softliners within the regime. So, for example, if peaceful transition from a sultanistic authoritarian regime is not possible to democracy, imagine how can we transfer from such kind of a gender apartheid regime to a kind of post-apartheid regime. So that means we need to think innovative ways how to address this crisis. Second, unlike previous apartheid regimes, that of the South Africa, Taliban apartheid regime is based on denial. They deny it. The Taliban have tried to create a certain form of equivocations by presenting and talking about ideals. For example, in the previous Taliban regime in 1998, Deputy Minister of Education, Said Shadi Khail, he said, well, we have recognized personhood and private autonomy of women, but also we have improved women's condition. Currently, Taliban's spokesperson, Zabiullah Mujahid, repeats the same words. So what you can see is they also obscure reality by justifying their policies as a short-term measures, the Taliban. For example, Sohail Shaheen once said that, well, these measures are temporary, and once the appropriate condition comes, we will rule back and move back to the normal condition. So now we have to, I recalled again Professor Anna Mayer of Pennsylvania, that authoritarian Muslim states resort to certain form of hypocrisy and equivocation when it comes to women's rights. For example, even I see resemblance between the Taliban, gender apartheid, and Saudi Arabia's. Once in 2007, when Saudi Arabia delegation was challenged at the CEDAW committee in United Nations with respect to the Saudis' ban of women from driving, you know what the Saudi delegation said? They said, we don't have any formal provision legally banning women from driving. So while actually such kind of practice existed, so in case of Taliban, many restrictions in Afghanistan and even in Iran are not stipulated in statutory laws. Why? Because, for example, in case of Afghanistan, lack of formal provisions could be understood in two things. Number one, some of these restrictions originate from customary provisions such as mullahs or ayatollahs fatwas that are not regularly documented. So that's why they just come verbally and then they are applied. So that's why we should not fall in this trap of denial. Secondly, Taliban does not have bureaucratic capacity and still is not familiar with running the state through formal regulations and bureaucracies. And at times, it rules by verbal decrees of its leaders. For example, and these policies are not implemented even in consistent manner. Therefore, one should be cautious of this being trapped in the Taliban equivocations and instead try to expose such kind of denials. And finally, the gender apartheid of Taliban is not just based on cultural relativism, but also a kind of public execution of violence against women could be understood as what some scholars say as a power as a spectacle. Like 90s, the previous Taliban era, the second phase of Taliban in post-2021 also engage in kind of public weeping, ampunation, public display of corpus. And all of this is for what purpose? This is to show an exercise of power and legitimacy by Taliban through use of power as a spectacle. So to end gender apartheid, global human rights defenders and international community must not only reject relativism, cultural relativism, which is a base for gender apartheid in this context, but also should use available tools or probably innovative tools. We should think about those tools to end Taliban exercise of power as a spectacle. I will stop here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Saib. I have time for one more question. So Dr. Saib Spanta, back to you. What action could be taken to put an end to this issue in Afghanistan?
I think as my colleagues and especially the legal experts have talked about it, I think the campaign is a good start to keep the awareness, the international awareness within the community high and to rise the pressure within the community and along the policymakers to stay strong in their demands. Because as I tried to outline that we have, on the one side, we have the humanitarian crisis, and on the other side, we have all these decrees against girls and women. And it's against the actual idea of supporting, having a good way of governance and staying strong within the tiers of all these politicians who try to engage diplomatically is, I think, challenging because they see geopolitically, they see that China is getting engaged and other authoritarian regimes are getting engaged with the Taliban, and they fear to lose Afghanistan as a very important strategic country. And I think that diplomats need to find some kind of balance. And from my point of view, they have to make clear that certain points like the gender apartheid and the policies against women are unacceptable. And with these policies and decrees issued, there's no way forward in having political ties. I think that's very important. And another way to deal with the Taliban would also be to be stricter on the travel. They should make clear that the travel ban is there and that they're not allowed to travel anywhere they want. And at the same time, the Taliban would like to travel, and they say, yeah, but we have to travel in order to negotiate about the political issues we have. They're very smart. They're living in the 21st century like us, but certain points have to make made clear, and that they have to be together. The Western countries, or let's say the international community, who really believe in their democratic ideas.
Thank you so much. I'm going to read some questions from the audience. Mitrajan, to you. Gita has asked that what we need to do to challenge and dismantle these views.
Thank you so much. So I think it needs more collaboration and collective work of all of us. I think in the past 1.5 years, understanding the crisis that happened, and everyone wanted to respond. So I think, and all of us were both our international allies and women inside and outside Afghanistan, women of Afghanistan. I think everyone wanted to respond in a way or other, because we were frustrated and afraid and shocked, and things were very short term. It was more of, I think, expressing our, our hate or our concern regarding certain issues. Now it's the time that we collectively, if we do campaigns or anything, work with more follow-ups and collaborations to get a result out of it. If it's a legal framework, if it's a policy, or if it's necessary pressure on the main stakeholders, it can be UN or other countries, Islamic countries. Because what really bothered me was one of the side events of CSW was OIC, Organization of Islamic Countries event, and it was for 3 days, and there was all Islamic countries. And imagine what the topic was, women in Islam, and there was no single woman from Afghanistan. There was no single agenda point about Afghanistan, while we are the worst human rights crisis in the world, first thing. And the second thing is, there is interpretation of it, but they are basing it on an Islam, even if their interpretation is more come with cultural base, or with terroristic or madrasa understanding, whatever. But the main clothing of what's happening is Islam, and they didn't have it in the agenda. Only 3 countries, prime ministers, including UK, that I was there, and I got mad and I got out, raised it, but they didn't have anyone from Afghanistan, and Afghanistan was not in the agenda. So what, for example, that is one thing what we can do if you're more aware of what's happening, where are the places we should be there, what are the legal or policy frameworks that we can leverage it toward, easing the situation for women in Afghanistan, how we can make sure, and another thing is the money that is going for human rights in Afghanistan, there is no gender sensitive monitoring and assessment of it. The people who are doing it, it's not gender sensitive. So I think there is a lot of things that are there that need more proactive response from activists and organizations that are working for Afghanistan. What we need at this point is make sure that we are more focused, we are more organized, and we work toward result-based initiatives. Because what happened in the past 1 year, and I understand it, we were shocked and everything was scattered in short term. So we need to now, I think, work on policy and program level for longer term things with more tangible results.
Thank you so much, Mitrajan. Gesujan, one of the audience has asked, how would the international crime law concept of crimes against humanity work alongside gender apartheid?
Yeah, so that was something we were touching on a bit in terms of the crimes against humanity of gender persecution. I mean, one thing to note about that, of course, is that persecution as a crimes against humanity can only be charged if another crime is charged as well under the statute. So if we're looking at the ICC and the Rome statute, that is a limitation. And as I noted in the opening remarks I made, we actually don't have any convictions for gender persecution just yet. Now, that may have something to do with the fact that witnesses and victims and survivors who are subjected to that may be reluctant to provide evidence. I think if you have the crime of gender apartheid, the useful thing about that is that then you are looking at structures and laws and the framework of what is leading to that crime. And so I think from an evidentiary perspective, it's actually quite helpful because there are very real world limitations in terms of who is prepared to come forward and give evidence about what is a very sensitive experience. There have been some charges for gender persecution that have been included in indictments, or what they refer to as the confirmation of charges at the International Criminal Court. But yeah, like I noted, it's been I think there's a general agreement that it's been a very under-prosecuted crime. And so I hope that with the push to recognize gender apartheid as a crime under international law, that will also help move the needle on looking into gender-focused crimes in general and ensuring that there is better prosecution of that, because we're certainly not at a point that we should be, I think. So.
Could I jump in on this question as well? Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead. Go ahead.
Thank you. So I think this is a very important question. So crimes against humanity under the Rome Statute, these are widespread or systematic attacks against any civilian population with knowledge of the attack. And I should note that both persecution and apartheid are considered crimes against humanity under this Article 7 of the Rome Statute. I think it's actually really instructive to read quickly the definitions of those two crimes and see the ways in which I think they would describe a situation like Taliban Afghanistan very differently. So persecution is the intentional and severe deprivation of fundamental rights contrary to international law by reason of the identity of the group or collectivity. This is certainly the case with the treatment of women in Taliban Afghanistan, but listen also to the definition of the crime of apartheid in the Rome Statute. That definition is inhumane acts committed in the context of an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression and domination by one racial group over any other racial group, and committed with the intention of maintaining that regime. So if you simply, again, substitute sex or gender for racial group, I think we get actually the much more accurate description of what is happening to women in Afghanistan, while clearly also meeting that prong of persecution. So I think this really explains why you need both approaches. And I understand that there are investigations ongoing of Afghanistan by the prosecutor's office at the International Criminal Court. I also know that this is somewhat controversial because of the decision by the prosecutor to only pursue certain actors which are sanctioned by the Security Council in this context. Nevertheless, I do think that one of the crimes being investigated is persecution. And I hope that will go forward. But what I would really like to see is an innovative prosecution for apartheid on gender-based grounds. And I think there's actually language in the Rome Statute which can be used to allow for this, because if you look at Article 21 of the statute, it says that the statute has to be interpreted in accordance with international human rights law and without any kind of discrimination. And so experts have suggested really using that Article 21 language would allow for, I think, a 21st century more inclusive definition of apartheid in Article 7, and would allow for a prosecution also for the crime of gender apartheid as a crime against humanity. And that's going to take huge political will and commitment by the prosecutor's office. And I know the ICC tends to be sort of small c conservative in its judicial approach. But I think that's what we should be pushing for in this context, while also supporting those, and I very much support those who are trying to see increased prosecutions for gender-based persecution. And I think there's one case ongoing there with regard to Mali.
Thank you so much. I think I'm going to ask you this, the next question too. Halima Kazim asked, what are the chances and what would it take in evidence and documentation to pursue a case at International Court of Justice or ICC based on gender-based prosecution or gender apartheid in Afghanistan?
So first, I think it would take the prosecutor, and I know that the prosecutor Karim Khan has expressed his strong concern about the situation in Afghanistan and specifically the treatment of women. So I know that he is very much thinking about these issues, but I think it would take a great deal of support, even more than we've already seen, expressed for the concept of gender apartheid. And as Gisu Jan's important campaign with many others, calls for specifically recognition of the international crime of gender apartheid, for him to feel that he has the space to move forward. And then obviously, I think it would be very important for experts to engage with the prosecutor's office, sending letters, sending memoranda, and so on, making the case for recognizing the crime of gender apartheid in Afghanistan and giving other examples of innovative kinds of prosecutions, such as the one I mentioned, the Akayesu case in the Rwanda tribunal. We don't stick with the international law exactly as it was interpreted from the 1940s or the 1970s. This is a living body of norms that we need to interpret in accordance with our understanding of international law today. But he will need a great deal of support to feel that he has the space to do that. So I think we need to keep having events like this. We need to keep circulating information about the gender apartheid framework. And I think we also need to keep engaging in dialogue with those who are pushing back against the use of this framework. And my guess is, I think there are a number of reasons why some states are more comfortable with persecution. One is obviously they have explicit language in the Rome Statute, but that hasn't been an obstacle in the past. If you think about even the way that violence against women as a concept came into the CEDAW Convention, that convention doesn't use the word violence once because it was drafted in the 1970s when women's human rights advocates were focusing on other things. And yet we've seen by the CEDAW Committee in the 90s a forward-looking interpretation that changed that. So I don't think it's just the lack of explicit text. I think part of what they're nervous about with the apartheid framework is that has implications for every other state, that has implications for international organizations. And in particular, I think, picking up on Professor Stanta's comments, that also means they have to look at their own complicity with apartheid, and they have to act towards the Taliban in a way which is in accordance with international law. And we're seeing clearly that there are international actors who don't want to do that. So I think we keep pushing on both tracks. We push in support of the gender-based persecution prosecutions, but added to that, we also push in support of innovative prosecutions for gender apartheid, whether it's in the ICC or whether it's in other fora, and perhaps even as creating a symbolic tribunal, as the so-called comfort women did in the past, as women in the former Yugoslavia did in the past, to try symbolically the Taliban leadership for gender apartheid and really have the leadership coming from civil society and from Afghan women human rights defenders pushing forward this concept.
Thank you. Mitrojan Harrison asked, how can funds be delivered safely, securely direct to starving women inside Afghanistan so they can eat, learn through online education before their internet is completely lost?
It is a very hard and complicated question because the de facto authorities, the Taliban's regime in Afghanistan, are in control of all both the central bank and the private bank. So anything that goes through them, of course, they have an eye on it. Even the humanitarian aid that's supposed to be fully managed by the UN, which they say it is, there are a lot of questions around it. But based on, I did an assessment of civil society, coordination between civil society in South Afghanistan and outside a month ago. The only way is, I think, staying relevant with what's happening inside Afghanistan and engaging with the local actors. Because I was amazed how they adapt on a daily basis and navigate ways that works for them. Because limitations are increasing. For example, they take an initiative that works today, but it doesn't work tomorrow. But then they find ways to make it work inside Afghanistan. They use their local means, some different ways, but they know what to do. So what I suggest is, instead of saying what are the secure ways, is just consult actors inside Afghanistan and listen to them. Ask them what works or what not work. That's the first thing. And the second thing is being more flexible on how we expect it to work with them. For example, formal means of reporting, or making sure that everything goes how it used to, or design something here and expect that works for the women in Afghanistan or all the people, is not really fair. So I think remaining flexible and engaging and consulting local actors is the best way to go forward. They're gonna find a way, and they're gonna tell you, believe me. Just it's important that we consult with them. That's my understanding.
Thank you so much, Mitra John. Gisu John, back to you. Fahima Ahmadi has asked, what is the solution for those girls who want their freedom under an Islamic law? For example, some protesters accommodated their equality wishing with Islamic rules.
So if I understand the question correctly, I guess it's asking for those that want an Islamic framework, how. So I think, I don't know if I'm well placed to answer that, because I do believe that that should be a choice. And so it's, I don't know how productive it is to have a legal framework that is derived from Sharia law, similar to what is at play in the Islamic Republic of Iran, and also what is enforced through, I guess, de facto positions, if not de jure positions in Afghanistan. And so I do believe that there needs to be a separation there. And obviously, should individuals wish to explore the compatibility of what they view as their rights with an Islamic legal framework, that is quite fine, and up to them to figure that out. But I don't think it can be something that is enforced by the state, because it then just as a matter of law, literally law, would then deprive others of the choice of wanting to move through life in that fashion. So I think there does have to be a separation in order for individuals who live in the state to be able to exercise choices as they please. I do know that there is a sort of rigorous, body of scholarship around the compatibility of women's rights with Sharia law. I will note that there was a movement on that in Iran for a long period of time. Many of our leading women's rights activists and scholars explored how there could be a reformist approach within the country, and how one could read more rights into what was a very restrictive Sharia-based legal framework. And the conclusion they really came out to was that there's not a lot of room there. And so it's sort of fallen out of favor, at least among Iranian women's rights activists, who have decided to discard that sort of reformist approach of looking at compatibility and really sticking strongly to the fact that this framework should not exist and should be dismantled, and then everyone can choose to do as they please. One thing that gives me a lot of hope is that there are a lot of women inside Iran, and I'm sure this is the case for Afghanistan as well, who are practicing Muslims and who not only are practicing Muslims, but have decided that they also want to, for example, wear a headscarf and wish to cover. And they have stood side by side, hand in hand with their sisters in arms who do not want to elect to do that. And so I think that unity among those who wish to observe their religion as they please and sort of move through life as they please, recognizing that everybody has a choice has been sort of fundamentally at the core of what these demands are about. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I think giving everybody the choice and then letting people evaluate how they wish to have their rights be compatible with that framework is probably the best outcome that preserves everyone's rights.
Thank you so much. Does anybody else have any comments to add?
I can add one. Yeah, Farangizhan, you go ahead after you. Well, on that issue, I think I do agree with Kisujan. But Islamic framework, to a large extent, as I argued earlier, has failed. What we have now in most of the Muslim countries has failed to acknowledge fundamental human rights for women, but also prevent such kind of incidents as gender apartheid in Iran and in Afghanistan. What I will say is a solution that some of the pluralist scholars have come up with. So you have on one hand monism or universalism, and on the other hand you have particularism, which some relativists also fall into that category. To reconcile both of these together, I think we can have that cross-cultural perspective, but that cross-cultural perspective should acknowledge at least a minimum set of values which are universal. So that will be probably called minimalist universal particularism. So you have certain universal values which are beyond the Islamic framework that even Islamic laws and framework should not neglect it based on whatever provision they have in their own Sharia law. But also there could be certain other interpretations. So yeah, because the way Universal Declaration of Human Rights was drafted earlier in post-Second World War, to a large extent that derived from the President Wilson's 4 freedom points and the way President Wilson's wife was involved in drafting this. Many other civilizations or countries, for example, India or China or Islamic world, did not see at that moment themselves included in the drafting procedures. But at this moment, in 21st century, I think we have reached to this stage where there is a minimum consensus on how human rights should be accepted universally. So solidarity with the women who are practicing Muslim, yeah, we can allow them to have, it's a choice to have hijab, for example, to have or not, to not have it. But no one, including Muslim laws, should not enforce it, particularly using the state apparatus in their favor.
Thank you so much, Dr. Saeb. Dr. Saeb, that's Spantal, back to you if you wanted to add something.
Yeah, thank you for giving me the last minutes. I keep it short. I think what Fahima Ahmadi was trying to raise is from her perspective as an Afghan woman being in Afghanistan, how to move within this frame of being persecuted for her basic rights, and at the same time being, in Farsi we say it, به چوکات Islami باشه, to stay in the framework of Islamic law. I think it's very hard to negotiate with the Taliban because their interpretation of the Islamic law, they publicly announce that it's Hanafi law, but it's not. It's actually a mixture of Wahhabism, Salafism, and Devbandi Islam. And they made the Islamic law, the Sharia law, the Hudud and Qisas, the base of their law, practicing law. I one solution would be maybe to engage someone, a legal scholar, an Islamic legal scholar with some kind of authority beyond, like globally. Maybe it would be someone from the Al-Azhar University who has some kind of authority to stay within this Islamic framework and to give some Islam imminent arguments for those women who really want to argue with the Taliban. They're trying to find a way to fight for their rights. We in Europe and the US, we can say, oh, we have an understanding of a secular understanding, and religion should be apart from governing, and there should be a rule of law in a secular sense. But people in Afghanistan face different problems on a daily basis, and they move within this framework, and they have to engage more closely with their local elderlies, with the shuras, with the council members, and it is a traditional society, so they have to navigate those problems. So that this could be maybe a way to negotiate and to have more cooperation with the organization, the Islamic organization, which Mitra John already attended and also raised very important points, I think.
Thank you so much. Mitra John, go ahead.
Thank you. So as my concluding points, I wanted to highlight this issue, and as a warning or something that we be careful of, is no one recognized Taliban as a legitimate government, and we shouldn't. What concerned me is discussing or shaping our discussion around this idea is that they are, the legitimate government, and how we work around certain ideas that we fit in or that we reform them, as Gesujan also mentioned too, because. Or I see some advocacy around issues of education or employment or a woman working in NGOs is how we can get some exemption, how we can work around the already existing decree. I think we should be very careful about that. If we are pushing for something, everything is so interrelated. For example, even if we get the right to education, if there is no freedom of movement, if there is no right to employment, it's de facto denial of right to education if in practice. So we need to be careful about that. So if we are talking about certain laws, for example, the constitution we had back in Afghanistan or the EVA law, a lot of those didn't actually were defined within the Islamic legal framework. But how it was worked around was, as long, if it's not in Islam, but as long as it doesn't go against Islam very directly, then we are okay with that. And I think that was how we worked with our civil laws. And people are not that traditional in Afghanistan. In the past 20 years, everyone agreed with those laws. Millions of girls were going to school. So it's not that people are so much, everyone in Afghanistan is, we want a fully Islamic law. Our previous laws were not. So I think by respecting to what's happening in Afghanistan, even like making sure that it doesn't directly go against Islamic law, but we doesn't have to put it within Islamic framework. And we need to be very careful about it. I want to say it again, is to not shape our discussions realizing that they are the legitimate government and they should be there, and we should do something to just be able to collaborate with them. What we push for is there should be some discussions or platforms that we all Afghanistan women-centered talk about issues, about the structure of the government. If they be part of the government, I don't know, but we shouldn't see them as the legitimate people that we work around their ideas. We should force them, we should force the world to force them that they abide by human rights issues and laws and values. So I think we need to be careful around that idea.
Thank you so much, Mitra John. Dr. Sadr, we have just 2 minutes. So I wanted to give the floor. So if you have any comment or add.
Thank you. I will be very brief on the issue of how to fuse Islamic framework with the human rights. I am not so much optimistic given even the last incident which happened in Iran among Iranians. The reformist Muslim scholars Abdul Karim Shro's remark about Gulshifta Farahani, which was a kind of misogynist to a large extent. So if even Muslim reformists cannot accept choices of Muslim women who are living in Europe and try to reduce them as a commodity. So I don't know what we expect from very other extremist or fundamentalist branches. But there is a successful model of Islam coming together with secularists or non-Muslims and to form a kind of political situation which is conducive for human rights. And that is, I think, Indonesian example wherein two Muslim leaders post 1998 Suharto. I'm referring to Nahdlatul Ulama and Muhammadiyah movement or parties, which was led by Abdul Rahman Wahid and Amin Rais. What they did was quite different, and they understood that Islamic countries, in order to come to a peaceful coexistence in a very pluralistic context like Indonesia, where you have Muslims, but also a tangible number of non-Muslims and particularly seculars, these two leaders abandoned their own Islamist parties and formed new parties wherein they coalesce with the secularists, with the non-Muslim minorities, and clearly denounced that an Islamic governance should not exist and that there isn't any model of Islamic exist basically. So I think Muslim leaders, if they want to address this issue, they should come up boldly and find ways in order to forge alliances with the non-Muslim minorities in their own countries, with the secularists, in order to prevent polarization just between Sharia, non-Sharia, Islam, and non-Islam. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Saib. Thank you so much, everybody. I wanted to thank the Afghan Institute for Strategic Studies. We come to an end. I wanted to thank our panelists for making the time to attend this event. I wanted to thank everybody who made the time to listen to our discussion. This discussion is recorded and will be available soon. Have a good day.